How's everything going today?
Going all right. How about you?
Good, good. I'm rushing back and forth from one thing to another.
Yeah, I thought maybe I'd missed something and was going to be alone today.
No, no, sorry for the late log on here. I'm just gradually kind of getting everything, pulling everything together. So I think, I don't know, based on the posts, I think that a couple more people are coming, but we'll see what happens. So yeah, Perplexity too, huh, Pat?
What?
You've been using Perplexity too.
Oh yeah, I like perplexity. Perplexity.
So how many do you pay for, Pat?
Not many. I'm not paying for perplexity. I'm paying for the recall.
Yeah.
I mean that's really useful. I'm hoping it doesn't go away.
You're worried it's not going to get a critical mass to keep it going or what?
Well, I think that's a prospect with almost any new
It
service.
is. I'm I'm I like it too, and I have a year's money invested in it. I want to see it get to the AI cross note. So you
Yeah,
can use AI now,
right.
but I think it'd be really great when it gets to the point it can kind of integrate stuff across the different notes. I like the when you put in see most of my stuff that I use here are based on PDFs, and I like when you import a PDF to it, it does this fairly extensive summarization, which gets to the point. It's so long, it's about as long as the original article, but anyway, applying AI to a bunch of summarizations is I think a maybe unique opportunity if they ever get there. That's the problem,
Well,
I guess.
it does integrate if you look at the graph and
Yeah.
it starts out with the individual nodes have plus signs on them. And you click on those plus signs, and very quickly you get a very large universe
Well,
that's
it
actually
seems,
interconnected between the various articles.
yeah, but also you know, what I don't like, and maybe most people do, is that it picks out all kinds of stuff. Like if you do a research article, it'll pull out names from the reference list and it's like it attaches them as a tag. And so you got this mountain of, I mean, for me anyway, it's like, I don't want all that. It's got so many tags that it's beyond, I guess it organizes the tags though within clusters, right?
Right.
Yeah,
And yeah, it can proliferate very quickly on things
right.
tags, but that on the other hand, I think that's useful.
Yeah, maybe. I what I think is interesting too is I haven't played with it a lot because like I said, I've been mostly working on just getting my PDFs in. That when you have it on and you're browsing something online, if it has a connection to something, to specific words within what you're reading, it
Yeah.
will,
It
indicate that.
shows up in your browser even though you haven't clicked it yet.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
No,
don't know.
I'm putting quite a bit of stuff into it. And then I take in the browser the URL for the particular recall article, and I drag it into the brain so that
Okay. So you
I
can,
I can connect it to all kinds of stuff.
okay. So yeah, you're
So
using
where
your,
does the recall content live?
Well, it says it lives locally, but it also connects
What is it you're
automatically
linking to, I guess
through
is
the
what I'm
cloud.
wondering.
It connects through the cloud between, for example, your PC and your iPad and your iPhone. So I
Right.
asked them the question, where does it live? And they said it lives in the browser cache. And that sounds kind of
well, yeah, if
um,
you clear your cache.
Yeah,
it's
that's what
kind
I'm,
of temporary as far as
yeah.
I'm concerned. And I didn't particularly like that because if I use it a lot, my cache lives
Mhm.
on my C drive, which is a SSD card and
Mhm.
has limited capacity. And
Well, and
I'd like to be able to choose where it saves the content.
yeah, yeah, and in any case, I mean, there's no guarantee that that a future browser update or upgrade, a new
We'll
version,
say,
isn't going to, kind of eliminate the cache in installing itself. Yeah, it does seem like, it's kind of weird because I've momentarily considered, as I actually was working, kind of getting my desktop together on a new machine and looking at all of the things in the tray and Skrintl was still down there and I thought, well, and I clicked on it and and it said, well, you're not you're no longer a member, you want to join back up again, and I considered it really, really briefly, but then the thing that put me off it, once again, was just kind of that question of, where does the data live? And as I was sort of digging into that and thinking, well, okay, what about those, what about all that content that I kind of created in it before? Is it just sort of dormant on some server in Ireland somewhere, or or what? And if I would re-up and pay to get access to it again, would it be there? And I wasn't entirely sure how I felt about that, realistically. So
You you've been giving away your social media data for free for years. Why
I know,
worry now?
I know, but this is actually written, that stuff was actually written content. It was like 1,100 notes, that were basically the kind of the pages of the textbook that I was kind of writing.
Well,
So
I'll make the prediction now that 10 years from now, people doing this won't own their data. They'll trust it to somebody else to lose for them.
yeah,
It'll
yeah.
live somewhere else, and you'll
World
be
Economic Forum,
exactly where we are with social media now is where we're going to be with AI a decade hence.
the Great Reset. You will own nothing, and
And we'll probably have something beyond AI that's the new thing that people will be ignoring this and doing something else anyway.
Yeah,
mhm,
I'll be in Saudi Arabia.
It'd be more of the same.
right.
Be in Saudi Arabia.
Yep, yep, and it'll be connected by Starlink. Yeah.
so
Um,
are we going to talk about another book today in addition to other stuff?
I was
Some of the
just
stuff is making me depressed.
Okay. Well, would the book that seemed to be the most on sort of the closest to kind of the on deck circle was that Reshore, the tariff book. Would that be too depressing, or is it?
I'm just, I'm just kidding. I mean, when you read this stuff, everything just seems kind of hopeless and, beyond personal control. I don't know
Yeah.
why
Is
are
there
we
another
even
reading, or kind of book note making oriented book that we should kind
Yeah,
of
but what would that be? That's the point.
I don't remember. I don't think anybody mentioned it since it came out, but Anne-Laure Lecomte has a new book of like a month and a half ago that came out.
What's that one?
And she's in kind of this, she's been for a while in this circle with all of us of, let me see if I can pull it up. I'm pretty sure I pulled it. It's called Tiny Experiments: How to Live Freely in a goal obsessed world. So she's been in it's Ness Labs. Some of you may know her by rather than her name, but she's
Mm,
been in Nick Milo, Tiago Forte kind of space for a while. I expected sooner or later she was going to come out with a book. I didn't expect this particular book of, essentially it's try a small experiment for 20 or 30 days or 20 or 30 times, see how it works, adjust, go from there kind of thing. So it's probably a little more in she's in the knowledge management space, but this feels a little more productivity oriented. So I don't know if it's been on my back burner, not pressing at all because I'm not sure I'll get much out of it, but
mhm.
I'll throw that out there as something new in kind of our tangential space.
Yeah. Another thing that we had talked about occasionally was sort of going back to some things, kind of reaching back into the past and, spending a week, looking at, like maybe Beatrice Webb's, or something like that keep coming up again and again. Do we want to do that?
So more, I don't remember that. What's specifically what you mentioned?
Well, the Beatrice Webb was something that came up in Chris's. Oh,
Well,
who's talking?
the other one is go back to a return author, but a different book. Or the other thing would be to go back to a book and then find the book that rebuts it. So what's the opposite of New History of Everything equivalent? And go with that. So we could take it a little bit more as a syntopic. It's not the same person, it's the same subject, but the other way. Other than that, the sideways look from somebody else is probably more interest at the moment than like the 11th book out of 15 on US poverty. Seeing it's such a majority item, including, in theory, everybody here. I mean, literally picking up on the element in the book, there is that little phrase, and I must admit, I hadn't quite appreciated, even though Mark particularly spoke about it 3 weeks ago, I think, the Citizens United case and the way that case allowed money in. And within the read for this week, there was the back of envelope calculation as to just how many people are we talking about as being those people putting money into politics. And it was like 6.8 times 10 to the minus 6 as a percentage of the US population. Like, yeah, so we're talking like 1,800 people over the 320 million, 340 million.
Yeah, again, in my depression, I sometimes try to figure out, okay, if I could change one thing, what would it be? And that's why I mentioned it a few weeks ago. Even if you could go back from plutocracy to oligarchies, that might be an improvement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that I've also thought of in the context of the condition that we're sitting in, and I mentioned it to Dan a couple of times, there's a YouTuber who thinks he's a bit of an historian and does pretty well on lots of his stuff on World War II. And some of it is European based, some of it's North Africa based, but he did something stupid like a 50-part goal run at Stalingrad. So he's each week, not this each week, he was coming out about he was trying to do it every Monday. And he did pretty well. We had a couple of blue bars. So for the 53 odd episodes of Stalingrad, it probably took him 65 weeks. And 75 weeks. But within the 50 plus editions for Stalingrad, he put out 10 or 12 non-Stalingrad and non-military battle versions where he explained certain amount of the Nazi economics and who and where the mythologies involved. A couple of bits on and I saw it again, somebody else, I think was in the US, decided that because the word socialist was in the Nazi Party translation,
but not quite the same as its background for Mussolini's party.
Mm.
That they weren't right wing, they weren't fascist, they were socialists. Just because you captured a word, it's in the name, so it's got to be on the tin, therefore it's got to be true. And some of them were, I think he got the wrong end of the stick and took it to the nth degree. But others threw up some interesting questions. And one of the books he pushes quite a lot by some 1940s, 50s German guy that was called The Vampire Economy. I forget the name of the author now, but it was some German guy. That looked like an interesting go. But that also reminded me of the fact that we were talking about looking at some of the Austrian economists like Hayek
Mm-hmm.
as it keeps coming up. And I don't necessarily think, unless somebody puts their hand up and says, yeah, I read it 5 years ago, I don't think any of us have quite enough context or say Hayek as a named economist that has led to where we are at.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know them well enough, fully enough. I would say that we ought to go and read possibly the outcome of some of what Hayek and co allowed to create, i.e. the non-fiction works of Ayn Rand or something. But it would be about time, I thought, that we get something a little bit more formal on the economic side.
Mm.
But I haven't,
Oh.
in spite of trying to get through a reading for this week. I haven't actually said to myself, let's go through my reading list and see which anything worthwhile that we've either mentioned in passing or we might have mentioned the subject or the author, but not that particular title or something. So I'm at a loss for what should be the next book in context of anything that we might have already touched upon in terms of a list for here. But that's just a thought. I think there's a lot of things that have come up with why things would be of interest at the moment. We're getting these two books particularly, we're getting very much the outcome of why things are, rather than the source point or the root cause, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I guess I wouldn't be against reading, reading like the original Road to Serfdom, and then maybe we would talk about, how it got Reader's Digested in
Clearly not the Reader's Digest.
Right.
Although,
but that, I mean, but the question, the issue of which of those things was more culturally, and how those ideas became culturally significant is interesting. I mean, and I guess it does, it does sort of fit into that whole kind of what's the new world going to look like after the Great War. So there are a lot of little historical threads, to pull on from that, which might be kind of interesting and timely for me, I guess, for summer reading. The other thing that I've been interested in really is kind of the source of this populist impulse, and I think we've talked, or I've mentioned quite a bit Thomas Frank, but I don't think we've ever read anything by Thomas Frank, have we?
I don't think so.
Yeah. And there's a book that I had bought. I'm looking at my Amazon history, and it looks like I bought Rendezvous with Oblivion, which came out I think last year, and I think I've got a hard copy version, a hard copy edition of it on my shelves back up north. It does seem like, yeah, I mean, the last time I sort of dipped into Thomas Frank, it was The People Know, and so it was sort of at the beginning of this, kind of recognition that this populist moment was happening. So I'd be a little bit interested to see, kind of where he took that, and what he thinks. The subtitle of Rendezvous with Oblivion is Reports from a Sinking Society. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily not going to be depressing, Mark, but maybe too, because I think Frank had a fairly good grip on. Well, I've never read Thomas Sowell. Yeah. Yeah. What's the matter with Kansas? I think I listened to a long, long time ago. I've read The People Know. I haven't read Rendezvous with Oblivion. I was surprised actually that Amazon notified me that I bought a hardcover copy of it in November of 2022, and apparently didn't read it. So it must still be on my shelf there in the new books section or something. But maybe that would be something to kind of read and compare with something older, that's a century old, like, Road to Serfdom, because I think they kind of deal with the same impulse, I think. Just, I don't know. What are you looking for, Chris?
I'm trying to think of what it was. Oh, yeah, all those and that setup kind of fit into some of the true believer because I've been interested in this how our kind of national identity has formed who we are, how national identities in other places have been formed that then get people into trouble or countries into trouble where you move from, you have drastic shifts from one form of government to another that usually involve heavy bloodshed or revolution or issues.
Hmm.
And some of those kind of economic pieces and I've touched into some of them, but I need to actually do a good cross reading. But I've been collecting books on especially politics and religion over the last century of things that are kind of American religious movements and how they tie into those ideas of kind of mass movements and shifts in identity,
Hmm.
or things like, the idea that all these very uber religious people are they're reading the tiniest, thinnest top layer of some of the religion, but everything they're doing on a daily basis goes against all the other tenets of the religion in terms of what we do and how we act.
Hmm.
And they say, "Oh, I'm a Christian and I'm a follower of Jesus," but everything they do from a governmental perspective is total hypocrisy. And I don't know what those books are, right? There isn't a book that gives me this straight answer. So you've got to read 10 different things.
Hmm.
But I could totally be into, and we've mentioned a handful of books on populism. I think we've mentioned Masha Gessen's, authoritarianism stuff or Anne Applebaum in the past. Some of those are all interesting or could be interesting to read together loosely.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I'm not
But
sure.
we've also touched on, people like Hayek so many times. I've never read any of his stuff. I would totally be
Hmm.
game to go back and look at that or Kane's work, especially with the historical bent that a lot of us have.
Mm.
I've never read any of his, or I've read bits and pieces of his big work, but never, cover to cover
Yeah.
as a means of looking at what he wrote then in that context and what it means for now. Because, you know,
Well, and right, and how it relates not only to, kind of macro theory, but monetary policy and Bretton Woods and all that because
Yeah.
he was there.
And he was writing at a time too before all those economics theories really like effloresced and turned into a whole mathematical space. And it
Mhm.
was so his stuff was a little more philosophical, I feel, rather than and theoretical coming out of a specific context for
Yes,
its time without,
right, right. As opposed to textbooky like
yeah.
Mansfield, that was just, to take that accepted body and sort of promulgate it out into the world of, this is the structure of this, the way that we've formulated our understanding of the economic world. Is there any interest in reading The People Know?
I do that. That was a pretty thin volume too, wasn't it?
It
As I
went, it went
recall.
pretty, it went pretty quick, yeah. Yeah, I think I have it over here. All right. Maybe I don't. I don't know. Oh, I've got another one. Oh, here's Rendezvous with Oblivion. That's really narrow. And also, the Rendezvous with Oblivion is, I do have a hardcover copy of it, and there it is. There's also one, let me see what the date of this is. 2000. So it's a little bit dated, but One Market Under God, Extreme Capitalism, Market Populism, and the End of Economic Democracy, which I think I picked up I picked it up from Thrift Books. So, and it is about, before the notes begin, it goes on for about 350 pages, all the way to the dot-com era and Princess Diana at the sort of the tail end of it. But it sort of begins with, yeah, it begins kind of in the 90s, and then it jumps back to the 30s. That actually, of if for if we want something of Frank that has a more economics and less cultural and to it, that might be something to pair with a Hayek. Let's see if we talk about Hayek in the index. He does not. Oh, he does. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, he talks about Hayek quite a bit, it looks like, in the chapter that's about the chapter called Getting to Yes. And he talks about him in the context of really the legacy of Hayek in the Reagan era, looks like. So Cass Sunstein, he's the nudge guy, right?
Yeah, I feel like that sounds about right.
Yeah. Um, that's certainly, I think, 2018 would be just before the nudge book, wasn't it? The nudge book is Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And apparently there have been a couple of editions of it. But it goes back to 2009. Okay, so there. Well, it'd be interesting to see what Sunstein thinks about how authoritarianism has or hasn't been brought about by nudging people.
Yeah.
Maybe a blind spot. I don't know.
So that's written somewhere in the middle of Trump's first term.
Yeah,
Well, assuredly, it had to have been started at book length that long. It, just to go through the process of publishing would have had to have been started 2015, 2016, even before he was
Elected.
probably contemplating an election because I mean, although he is an academic, so he may have a shorter writing cycle and he's written enough stuff. I think he's got a background to say, hey, a
I
publisher could turn that around in a year and a half.
based on the way it's described, on Amazon, it looks like it was a response to Trump, which and also and a comparison of it with the Sinclair Lewis novel. So that may have been easier for him to kind of pull off because he may have already had a lot of material, a lot of things to say, a lot of ideas in the bag about Sinclair Lewis and that moment in the
Well, it says it's a collection of essays too, right?
yeah,
It's not written from an overall outline.
yeah. Yes, and it looks like he's the editor of it. So yeah, so let's see who else is. Oh no, that's the Audible. I don't want the Audible. Give me the paperback. Oh my goodness, a lot. Eric Posner, one by Cass Sunstein. Um, a lot of names I don't recognize. Another Road to Serfdom by Timur Kuran. Bonapartism, How Democracies Perish. I don't know. That it may be the thing that I would be nervous about would be the degree of kind of New York Times op-ed moral panic.
Yeah, yeah. And
Because
I'd
which
almost
may which may
rather,
which may just have may not be irrelevant or incorrect, but may just have we might just be able to stipulate that and
yeah, I think that's the thing that gets me about that too, is some of them may be more kind of zeitgeisty. It's interesting for now, but as not as weighty a thing as going back and looking at, Frederick Hayek or something like that, you
yeah,
know,
yeah, of everything.
was relevant then, relevant since, and still relevant now in
Yeah,
terms of the weight it has for who we are and where we're at.
yeah. Of everything, I guess the thing that sounds like it might be the most fun to me would be the real Road to Serfdom, the Hayek book, and then maybe I'll compare that with this Thomas Frank, and maybe I'll have some things. But why don't we focus on the Hayek for a couple weeks?
I'm
Yeah,
not opposed to that.
I bought it somewhere along the line because it was referenced so frequently in this group,
Right.
and I tried to work on it. So, but I admit I gave up. So, in the context of the pressure, peer pressure here, or whatever, I've already got it, so it's fine with me.
I think I had a very old paperback reprint of it, but looks like there's a new definitive edition with text and documents. It's not that expensive. I wonder what the documents are that it comes with.
Oh, I bookmarked it ages ago too because it dovetailed with some of the things we talked about, and it's Hayek. But he also has a book, The Use of Knowledge in Society, which just on its face, I didn't delve into it very deeply, but because we are who we are, I think I
Right.
bookmarked it at some point, looking at the bigger list of his stuff.
This new definitive edition has a bunch of prefaces and forewords over the years. So it's got the original preface, then it's got a foreword from the 1956 American paperback, then it's got a preface from the 1976 edition. So those might be interesting little historical moments. And then in the appendix, it's got documents on Nazi socialism, readers' reports by Frank Knight in 1943 and Jacob Marchak in 1943. Another forward to the 1944 American edition and and an introduction from 1994 by Milton Friedman. So there you go. A lot of context. Yeah, why don't we do that?
Wait, who published that version
That is
that you
the
were looking at?
It's from the Collected Works, Volume 2.
Oh, okay, so that's got to be the
University of
University of
Chicago.
Chicago.
Yeah.
Okay,
University of Chicago Press.
the definitive edition.
Yeah, so here's the link in the chat.
I think that was the one I had been looking at too. So
Yeah, and apparently there is actually even I don't know, it looks like there's an audio book, unabridged audio book version of it. I wonder if that's got that. Yeah.
and give it another decade, Norton Critical Editions will have a version of it.
Yeah,
Although University of Chicago, I think, is probably making so much money still off that book that
right. Yeah, they probably won't.
they would ask for too deep a cut for Norton to publish it.
Yeah. And let's see, the first couple of sections. Yeah, I mean, if we read the first, it seems to begin, the actual text of it seems to begin on page 65, and the first 5 sections run to about 111. And that is the, kind of introductory stuff, and then individualism and collectivism, the inevitability of planning and planning and democracy. There are in all 16 sections, so we could do it over, I mean, realistically, we could do it over a couple, 3 weeks.
Yeah. That sounds like a plan.
Okay. Cool.
And if we need a tonic, I've been delving back in this week to the classic works of Gil Scott Heron from the early 70s on, although he fits more into the area of poetry, which we haven't done a lot of.
Mhm.
And then for those who don't know or don't have the context, he also is kind of one of the early godfathers of rap music. So a
Oh,
lot of his early 70s music has been like heavily sampled into the rap universe in the last like 2 decades. But a lot of the stuff he talked about in kind of he was an author, a poet, and most people know him, I think, as a musician. But he did a lot of spoken word stuff. Like, he had one called Whitey's on the Moon. Like, I can't pay my rent and get health care, but Whitey's on the moon, which I totally want to make into a bumper sticker now so I can slap onto all the Tesla trucks I run into in the wild.
Right. That's funny. Oh yeah, I see a lot of
Whitey's on the moon should totally be a bumper sticker.
it totally should.
But it's impressive to me how like heavily relevant his lyrics and music and poetry from the early 70s on still is today.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. I'm looking at that's interesting. Huh.
One of the other screwy things too, and I picked it up and pulled out a couple things from it while we were doing all this plutocracy and oligarchy business the last like couple weeks, and it kind of goes back to that political identities and religion. But Kevin Phillips has several books, one on theocracy. There was another one that was it was closer to what we've been reading called Wealth and Democracy, a political history of the American rich was what I dug out. But he was the Republican strategist in the 60s who essentially plotted out what the demographics of the next 3 or 4 decades would look like and put the Republican Party on a path to, in fact, I think he may have been the guy who came up with the phrase Southern strategy.
Oh wow.
But he is a theorist and a kind of political historian, but he's written a lot of stuff in that kind of space that kind of dovetails with what happens when you mix money and politics or religion and politics, and whether he was prescient or not, you know. But some of his stuff has been kind of interesting but I've only picked it up in bits and pieces as we've read other stuff like the oligarchy piece the last few weeks. And it seems to that, and I can't remember the name of it, but it seems like there was a religious history text you mentioned at some point, Dan, about the, first, second, third reformations as it related to America and American religion. But I
Oh,
tried
the
to look for it this week and I couldn't find. I thought there was something really good somewhere, but I couldn't find
Great
it.
Awakenings. Yeah.
Maybe
There was a I might have mentioned a history that kind of dealt with the burnt over district. Let's see, what the heck was that called? Uh, It'll come to me. It was about how it was kind of about how religion, how the third great awakening especially, and sort of social control and especially economic control went together in Western New York. It'll come to me in a minute.
is that the Hoffman?
Mm-mm. Gosh, who is it? I want to say how, but I'm not sure if that's right. I'll look at it.
Yes, there's a lot of books about the Great Awakening. Man,
It's not the Whitney Cross book. It's not the one I'm thinking of. Yeah, the Great Awakenings are kind of interesting. Yeah, and the Transcendentalists are interesting. That's kind of a deep dive. Hmm. It is not jumping out at me. There are a lot of interesting, yeah, so I'm just kind of looking at the things that pop up. There are a lot of interesting things. That is kind of an interesting use of AI. to, to pull these things back out. Do we want to talk about the ends of these two books? The degree of unequal representation in the US Senate is by far the most extreme in the constitutional stacked deck in Plutarch in the Formasano book. Reminded me of
Well, I was slightly impressed that the second one we started actually referred back to the first one with,
Hmm.
with
Mhm.
at least one topic link, and it was like, oh, yeah, I know that because, but in part, as I said earlier, for whatever reason, look, I knew the phrase citizens united, but I had no real
Mhm.
concept
Yeah,
of its depth and breadth and cause. And
yeah.
then, particularly reading the last two in the Plutocrats book, I suddenly realised, of course, that it's all post the West Wing,
Mhm.
just
Yeah,
to get a quote in.
right.
And, and from there was one of the things that I thought straight off was, and I can't remember the exact context now, but there was some gun issue. and it might well have been the original shooting at the end of the season where Josh gets a bullet and Bartlett gets a grazing and a couple of other people get hurt, and target turned out to be Charlie.
Hmm.
But Seaborn says about something along the lines of, well, this would be easy. Let's just all join the NRA and call a vote. As if, you know, a few million Democrats who probably don't own a gun and got their gun license either just turn up at the NRA
And subvert it.
stealthy wise. One assumes that they all get to be told, don't say you're a Democrat, don't say you're not a gun owner, etc., etc.
Mhm.
And then just flip the organization from inside.
Yeah. Yeah. What about
But it sort of struck me as that's how we ended up with Starmer, in the supposed Labour Party.
Mm.
But
It's dismantled from within. Well, what about what about Christopher Freeland's point that is quoted in here in this chapter? Which chapter is it? This Decline of the Commons section, where the point that she was making is that Formosano picks up on is that the super rich are stateless, right, and have more in common with each other because they just flit, on their private jets that they're time sharing, from one venue to another, that all pretty much have the same sets of amenities, and expose them to the same kind of world wherever they happen to be. I thought that was an interesting, I mean, that's an interesting, that is kind of an interesting observation, and it does, it does roll right into, those whole, that whole kind of plutocrat theory about the World Economic Forum, and all of these different groups of people.
Got to be working in a reasonably decent 5-star hotel and go. The bulk of these people,
well, and
are who are taking the suites, not the rooms.
Right. And apparently the Qataris like giving large jets to people. Apparently this is not what they're doing with Trump.
The sideways look on it is that this jet, they've been trying to sell it for the last 4 years. It's too big, too costly, too expensive to run.
Right.
And because of all the rubbish inside it, it's too inflexible as to where it can land and take off.
Oh.
So the obvious thing is to give it away to somebody that knows fucks what about anything, including the shit that comes out of his mouth.
Unloaded on some sucker.
So it's a literal white elephant.
No, it's a literal gold brick
gold-plated
on the end of a very short runway and stuck. But one of the instant responses here was, I wonder how long it's going to take to sweep it clean of all the bugs that are clearly now going in fast.
Oh yeah,
because he's bit. It's not landed yet. It's not actually shifted yet, but it's close. And the other one that came up, of course, that I thought was oddly sort of, you need to look at it with a tilted head. His first overseas trip on the first time around was here.
The hands on the globe picture, yeah.
And he's come back, but quite a frequent statement in the first 100 days in both times around in his current role is, I hate Muslims. So So
When did he say
it
that?
seems odd. Well, it's the content and the context. You
About
know,
the Muslim ban.
we'll ban Muslims coming to the US, and then the next first thing he does is he comes here. Doesn't go to Israel. He comes here to the Muslim side of the world.
Mhm.
So it's it's to me it semi reinforces he doesn't know or mean what he says.
Well,
Doesn't
yeah,
necessarily know why he's saying it, and they're eating the
imagine
pets.
that.
So
Imagine.
it's
Shocking.
it's just complete. Yeah,
Well, and
and
that does seem to be what people have been observing, right? Is that there seemed to be one direction, and then for about a month there seemed to be kind of a shift in another direction, and now he's gone back to this first direction,
well,
which
I,
suggests to me that there's that he is not having these ideas. These ideas are being had for him, and
uh, yeah,
and
which
within the organization there is some some
it's
fighting going on
what I
over what the
what I what I
actual
haven't
policy
what I
position is going to
haven't
be.
bothered to, what I haven't bothered to figure out is, are they reading him Project 2025 in chapter sequence, or are they just flipping it open somewhere before he goes to bed and reading him a section, and so that's what he goes to bed with,
I
and therefore that's
think
what he
they leave
dreams.
it in the bathroom.
Oh no, the real way to do it is to post bits and pieces to 4chan in bite-sized nuggets that can be memeable.
Right, right. Well, okay. It's funny too because along the way, there are so many things that are sort of forgotten and swept under the rug. We were just talking about this decline of the common section of the Formisano book, and and the mention of Christopher Freeland, but in that section also there's all this talk about in the context of Christopher Freeland, international banks like Credit Suisse, Freeland noted, pay close attention to the difference between the world's rising middle class and the increasingly shared and global character of people at the very top. And I mean, it seems like Credit Suisse and UBS and Deutsche Bank, were very much in the news there for a while, and then managed to pull themselves out of the news and disappear from the news cycle, and kind of also from our memory of who were the big villains,
But
and who was getting
it
away with.
it does seem to be a game of sort of whack-a-mole in in a slightly different sense. Is go back to day one, pick a story from there that's still valid, that I know something has been done and done sufficiently well within the general context that it's been done, and it's done and finished. And it'd be it's a bit like that place that Pat and I posted up as being this is a site that is tracking the 2025 pieces. But I don't think that site is stating when it's done in such a way that it is now law, such that it would be difficult for the 48 person to undo. Not necessarily possible, but difficult to undo. And this is also, I think, where there's obviously been a lot of teaching everybody, mostly US people, but everybody else to a certain extent, on how Congress and the House works. And things like, you need a 65% vote to overthrow the presidential veto. And he hasn't even had to use that yet. He hasn't got there yet. He hasn't allowed anything, particularly to come to the House and go through one way or another. The court seemed to have stopped him in a few instances, but it's like, why why has there been a statement of there are protests in every state every day, yet we don't seem to see any material effects of that coming out? If there's that much protest, what else is not happening that we're not getting reports on? So are we, and we've all the people with their own Substacks and YouTube channels and all the rest of it, there does seem to be a lack of 360-degree view.
Well, who can
So
have a 360-degree view though when there's literally our lives are prestidigitation. There's so much coming in that it's always look over here, look over here, look
but
over here.
but
And you're
some
always looking over here. So
Yeah.
you're
yeah, but
missing.
somebody would have said, somebody, you get the likes of, keep it within the West Wing thing. You get somebody like Lawrence O'Donnell or even Rachel Maddow would say, oh, by the way, look here, and it would be impossible for it to be totally escaped. And it just seems odd
Hmm.
that there isn't something that is popping up. It's almost as though, I mean, take Occupy Wall Street.
Hmm.
That was like almost 2 years long.
Yeah.
It didn't really go out of Wall Street. It crossed the world in terms of news coverage. I don't think everybody was able to look at it and understand what was going on totally, but there was enough information in the round that most people could, if they wanted to know. But it's like, okay, we've got a $400 million 747-800. What's wrong with it? And almost nobody over your end of the pond seems to have picked up that. Do realize this has been on sale for 4 years. They couldn't give it away. Now they've found a sucker.
And they can take the big
And
weight off for it. Yeah. Well,
oh, and
you
and,
know,
and, and see how you can use it. It's like, yeah, he's got a few long runways, so it'll be. I'm not even sure he's got a big enough one in Florida. So if he parks it at Andrews,
wow.
he can't use it to pop down to Mar-a-Lago.
Wow. Well,
Perhaps
maybe
I
they
don't
need to
know.
look into that. Yeah. You should text them or get in their DMs on X or whatever. It's kind of, I mean, and obviously the way these things are communicated is a big part of the story, right? I'm reminded of a couple weeks ago. I sort of started discovering what's her name, Batya Unger Sargon, who said so, who I saw get as a guest on some things, and she said some interesting stuff, and she seemed intelligent, and so I got kind of interested. And one of the things, in sort of her origin story apparently is that a couple years, she tells a story again and again, and how a couple of years ago she was exposed to this report that she actually said she had to put aside for a while because it disturbed her so much that she wasn't sure what to do with it. And this would have been when she was kind of a lefty. She now describes herself as a MAGA socialist, but at the time she was a lefty, and she read this study that said that Democrats, the gist of the study was that Democrats talk down to people, right? And that conservatives, Republicans apparently don't. And that the language the language that they put their ideas in is different. And they're talking, that there's some type of measurement was done that suggested that when these, left strategists are talking to each other, they're using this kind of discourse at this kind of level with this kind of complexity and nuance. But then they sort of dumb it down for the audience, especially, she was apparently especially annoyed or thought it was a good thing to talk about, that especially when they're talking to minority audiences, they tend to do this. Now, that was interesting to me. But then sort of the other shoe to drop is that, well, what does that mean about the other side? That the conservative or Republican or MAGA side just doesn't think at that high level in the first place, or they don't think, or they don't have that kind of nuance, or that they,
Well,
because it doesn't seem like the message that people who go to Trump rallies necessarily get. Now, and I'm willing to stipulate that probably the way it's reported doesn't do completely justice to a soup to nuts Trump appearance at a political event or whatever. But even so, that the fact that they can cherry pick stuff out of it that looks really bad suggests to me that, that some of it is not particularly nuanced. And that some of it is just, Trump riffing and going off on his kind of wild jags. So yeah, so what does that mean about the way the message is put out there into the world? Go ahead. I'm sorry, Mark, I interrupted
Well,
you.
I'm just saying I've heard the same thing, that it's too academic or whatever. And it just seems there's some kind of inconsistency here in who the message comes from and their wealth, let's say, and who the message is received by. And is one group better at, you know, messing with? I mean, it's kind of weird to think, if that's what they're saying, that the ultra wealthy have a way of thinking about life that is easier to communicate to people who are not in that situation than, say, middle class folks
Mhm.
who, according to this argument, focus on a very intellectual, I don't know, way of communicating and explaining and justifying. I mean, that's what I mean. And like, I've always been interested in hillbilly elegy because when I read it at first, it made a lot of sense to me. And then, again, it's that, well, now you find out this guy is really very, very different than that, but he's explaining to you the motivations and the understanding and the worldview of people who obviously are very different from him.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's real or
Um,
how
I,
that's done.
well, a piece of it though is pure rhetoric because
Yeah,
I grew up, my childhood home was 20 miles from the start of the Appalachian Trail headed north. And
Mhm.
I have, of people I know, I have the ability to do one of the deepest insane Southern accents on the planet. And I also left
You've
the
never
deep
treated me that
South
way.
and went to, I went to Johns Hopkins. I didn't go to Yale, but I also left behind that thing and became part of a dramatically different culture because I had the ability to leave and I have the ability to code switch between the two,
right,
but I make a more conscious choice to live in one society and not the other. But
right,
I can sympathize. But he created that story and harkens back to the other side to get the votes, not because that's who he really is. He may sympathize somewhat with the people around him where he grew up, but he is totally of a different stripe. And literally, he's trying to straddle the creek and do both.
Mhm.
And but he's only doing it in image only to
right.
draw
Yeah.
the political strength to try and stay where he's at.
Mhm.
Well,
But all
one
of his
one of
actual
the
political strength and power comes from being the total tech bro.
right. Well, one of the authors had a concept that fits very well with that, talking about all the ultra rich being educated at Harvard at the university and college level, but going to public, high school somewhere. And the concept, as I understand what the author was trying to say, is um, you need to understand where the pressure points are for whatever your field is at the level of the consumer,
Mhm.
but you then, I forget which author was, which did that, but that was an interesting, idea presented, and it was discussed several times that look at the people, they're not coming out of ultra high end high schools. They're coming out of middle class high schools, but they're going to the Ivy League colleges, and something about that mix of life experiences
Mhm.
gives them
Well,
an
yeah,
advantage, gives them an advantage in this time of great turmoil or whatever.
I think I have heard that recently too, in the podcast world. People have been saying.
Well, there's
I think even Tucker Carlson said on his show the other day, said something about,
Maybe.
that the big eye opener is to have experienced both of those things, public high school and then the Ivy League, right?
Right.
And to see that
Exactly.
contrast, right? And especially to see the legacy, because actually I think it was in the context of he was he was making fun of Douglas Murray's debating tactics when Murray had been debating Dave Smith, and he said, this isn't a real debate. This is prep school. These are prep school debating tactics. He doesn't even know. You don't know. You don't know Euripides. I think the quote he used was, or the context he said was Euripides. You don't know Euripides. You know a quote from Euripides, and you deploy that, right, and to great effect in your prep school debate. But it is, I think that is relevant. I mean, I knew some people who went from, the public high. I was in a big public high school. I had a graduating class of like 600. So, but and there were some people who went to the Ivy Leagues. There were actually a couple of people who went to Yale and Harvard. I didn't. I went to the University of Massachusetts. But that's a whole lot different, from my former friend, the historian and letter writer from America, who went from Phillips Andover to Harvard,
Right.
and
Yeah,
straight
that's a
through.
kind of classic.
well, some of it too, you could look at it as brain drain because in JD Vance's case, in my case, almost every other case, I left small rural Georgia, and the town I graduated from high school in is in the district that Marjorie Taylor Greene
Mm.
is from.
Mhm.
So I leave and I go off to college, and I was the only one who went really out of state. I think one other person went to Ricks College, which is now I think part of BYU technically for religious reasons. And I think maybe one person went to University of Alabama out of 100 people in my high school. I
Mm.
went to Johns Hopkins and never went back.
Right.
Yeah.
Almost all of this even cohort of the other 10 people behind me who went to colleges in state, if they went to Georgia Tech or University of Georgia, almost none of them still live in that same small town. So there's a brain drain of all of us, the 10 or so who went to college,
Sure.
did not go back.
Right.
We're not leaders in that small community. We didn't go back, we didn't do the thing.
Right.
And we left and we went to the big city. We left the small town. It's similar. JD Vance leaves his rural Appalachia, and he does not represent those people anymore. He represents dramatically other interests. He left and he did not go back. He pretended to go back for political aspirations, but really he does not represent those people at all.
Mhm.
And he has that brain drain the same way Chinese and Indian students leave their small countries or small cities and countries. They come to America. They rarely ever go back to their original country.
Right.
And it becomes a brain drain. And then it leaves those small places without actual leadership to do those things. And they're, so in some sense, yes, I totally failed Dahlonega, Georgia. I failed Calhoun, Georgia. And everyone who was there has hopes that, this smart kid who is us left to go to the big school, and they hope I come back and do something useful, but
Right.
almost almost never does that happen.
Right. You
And
come
that and
back,
that's a
you come
huge
back
issue.
as a vacation visitor and drop a little bit of money there, but that's the extent of it.
Well,
Yeah.
and even at that, I think I've been back to Dahlonega once in we went 2, 3 years ago,
Mhm.
but that's the first time I've been back,
Yeah.
you know, in 25 years. So,
Mhm.
and it's not even like I go back for high school reunion type stuff,
Yeah.
Yeah.
really. So and that's a huge piece, and it's all these towns see all these people leave, and they never, almost never come back.
Right.
But the
It's
book is
very,
using that, yeah, you don't go back, but the book is using that combination of life experiences as an advantage in comparison to being born into wealth, going to, having only experiences with other wealthy people, all the way up, which is a little different. I mean, yeah, that's an interesting observation about the brain drain. I think that what the author is saying though is if you're going among the ultra, well, they have this new concept of the working rich as opposed to the whatever
That's
came
freelance
before.
concept. Yeah.
And what's another part of that that's really interesting, I thought in the book, is this almost righteous indignation that a lot of these ultra wealthy people have. Not everybody, but they see themselves as making that transition and therefore deserving and questioning the
Mhm.
inability of others who are really motivated and really well worthy or with high aptitude to make the same transition. And it's, you know they have an advantage. It's like so many kinds of opportunities we don't realize we have.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, I understand exactly what you're talking about. I made a comment to somebody once about essentially to the effect they're talking about poor people and growing up poor, and I said, "There's no way. Don't tell me, I can outpour about anybody if I want to, talking about growing up on a farm, burning corn cobs for heat." So don't try to impress me by your poor background. That's not the point anymore. You still need to look at why some people can make a transition. I was white, I was male. I mean, I had a good family life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are opportunities most people, whatever their starting point in life, don't have, and I did. So I don't know. I think I just found that very interesting. There's some combinations there that are interesting. One, what kind of life experiences are valuable? And then this perception of now that I got it, I deserve it. And anyway, that's
Yeah. Well, I think
my
that that's an interesting, I mean, it's an interesting point of comparison because I think at the moment that Chrystia Freeland sort of made that comparison, it was possible to do that because they were looking back, this was the tech
right.
bubble generation, right? That had that
Yeah.
opportunity that was created for them mostly by the computer revolution and the internet revolution, right? And the the financial opportunities that came out of that, which, did give them an opportunity to look back a generation previously to the people
Right.
who only had wealth because of generational inherited wealth
Generation.
or because of this financialization of the economy and everything which you could perceive and you could describe as having been more evil more or more about sort of leaning on that inequity in social relationships and perpetuating it in a way I think it was possible for the tech elite to believe that they had actually created value, right? Now to whatever extent I think that the bloom has gone off of that rose, right?
Well, it's
I mean, it
also,
no longer seems like maybe Facebook is virtuous, empire
right.
of value creation.
Well, Clayton, I don't know if you've ever read any Clayton Christensen, but his business, he does a lot about disruption and what it takes to take advantage of disruption and looking at tech especially, disruption was brought about by the Apple computer, kind of in my opinion, which was a kid's toy.
Mhm.
but and you could afford it and you could learn to program it on your own and you could, but now we're in an environment where everything is just the opposite. Even universities, can't afford to do real AI research because they can't afford the compute and the, you know, so the world has changed, but the people who have made the change have a different worldview based on circumstances of their time,
Mhm. Well, and
which are about
oftentimes still
working hard and
imagine
learning to
themselves
program
as,
and whatever.
as people who are carrying forward that dream from the 1984 Apple ad where she spins around
Right.
and throws the hammer through
Uh,
the big screen.
uh,
And that was, and there was something to that, right? There
right.
was a very entrenched and very hierarchical and structured and elitist media, for example,
Right. Yeah.
that got totally disrupted by technology. There was a very, well, maybe I shouldn't say this. I was going to say there was a very exploitative music industry, but I don't know enough about the music industry to say that with. So maybe you can challenge me on that,
Yeah.
Chris, that it was. I mean, because the story that has been told subsequently has been that, that the net effect
Okay.
of disruption of the music industry was positive in that it wasn't all that great for anybody but the people at the very top in the first place.
Well, it definitely hollowed out the bottom and the middle. So there is a space at the very top where the uber famous musicians, the Taylor Swifts and the Beyoncés, and are
Mhm,
still they own a little bit more now, although they're still propped up by, big music, and that apparatus
mhm,
does that. But all the bottom and middle of the music industry shifted to totally online, and that's where all the big money is. Although if you're a day-to-day musician now, you you make more money touring and selling t-shirts and hand selling albums than you're ever going to make from actual sales of music or streaming because there's no money in it.
right.
And you're doing that to create the platform to sell the other stuff, and
Mhm,
that's where you make your money.
yeah, yeah.
But the other piece that kind of fits into this, that hits the what's his name's weird thesis, that the sizes of our families and communities have gone from multi-generational families and large extended families of, hundreds of people, and it has shifted down to like the individual family unit. And it's in part what makes it easy for me when I leave my family in the South. I'm only leaving my immediate family. I'm not leaving my extended family who live somewhere else. So when I go to the big city, I'm creating my own new family unit of three people, me, my wife, and my kid, and maybe our dog.
Right.
And I'm not as reliant on my parents, my brothers and sisters, my grandparents, my cousins, aunts, uncles, the whole nine yards. That's somewhere else.
Mhm,
But I'm not reliant on them the way I would have been a century ago, which is part of that kind of tension in small town America, where people are far more reliant on those extended families. And that's why, in part, they stay. They
mhm.
either don't have the education or fortitude or ability to leave and go somewhere else to do that thing in the big city, which also I think causes a lot of the depression and other issues we see in society. So there's something to be said about that kind of like let's keep the family unit cry that
Mhm.
the Republicans and the right have been hewing against for the last, half century or more. There's a piece of that, but at the same time, culturally, we have so heavily moved away from it that
Yeah.
vast swaths of the US, and particularly the big cities, you're not as reliant on those things, or
Right.
the social fabric of the Elks Club and the Moose Lodge for your entertainment.
Right.
Is that
Well,
good? Is that bad? But that piece is also a chunk of what helps the oligarchy kind of survive is where, and to pull up, we'll have to drink for yet another West Wing reference. You know, there's a scene where they're talking about generational black wealth, and we want to not be taxed away the generational wealth because the first generation of African American millionaires is coming up.
Hmm.
And or similarly, I think there was another quote in there too, like we don't want high taxes because there's going to be that day when I too am a multimillionaire and I
Right.
don't want you to tax it away, even though statistically now that is almost never going to happen
Yeah.
in the society that we've built. Like if you're poor and you think you want low taxes because you might be
Rich someday.
taxed away,
Yep.
like
Well, that
yeah,
goes all
it's
the way. I mean, but that goes all the way back to Tocqueville said that, right? That America's filled with, with people who are, just momentarily, distressed kind of millionaires. But there was, I mean, in the post World War II generations, right? There was really that shift to kind of the nuclear family away from the kind of extended family and support structure. And and so I mean, and I experienced that in my own life, right? My parents went away. They left they both, my mother and my father, their families were both around the Boston area. They moved away to upstate New York, where I was born, and my sister was born. And then ultimately, they did move us back to Massachusetts so we could be a little bit closer to our cousins and stuff. But still far out, in the burbs, half hour, 45 minutes from where everybody else lived in the Boston area. And so that was, so we were the little self-contained unit. And and family was still an important value, but it was a different, kind of an understanding of family and definition. It's kind of weird because earlier what I wrote down, I mean, the Apple disruption that you were talking about, Mark, kind of led me to, and that whole idea of the way that, industries change, like publishing and music and stuff like that. It reminded me of, I kind of remember when Amanda Palmer and Neil Gaiman and Cory Doctorow were all about this new model of the dandelion economy, right? Where you would just blow the seeds out into the world, and they would drop, and then some of them would drop on fertile soil and grow dandelions, but you didn't know, you didn't have control. And there was something that was portrayed as being challenging, but ultimately their claim was that there would be a net benefit from that to society, I think. Or maybe it wasn't really, maybe they weren't really claiming that. Maybe they were just saying, well, we're the people for whom that works, so we're leaning into it. Because if you're Neil Gaiman or Amanda Palmer, you can put on a wedding dress and stand on a box and people will bring you money. And Cory Doctorow, I don't know, his whole deal was, the whole information doesn't want to be free or does want to be free, or we don't really know what it wants. But there was a lot of pontificating about that, and I do remember that because at the same time that I was listening to that, on podcasts and reading that in books and stuff and on the web, I was also hearing other stuff from, people like Jaron Lanier, who had a different perspective on it, and Bill Joy, who wrote the famous Wired article, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us.
well, some of it too reminds me of the intellectual humanist movement of we have all this knowledge and we're building something, but still, how do we be people? And I see bits and pieces out of the kind of tech elite with the Jaron Laniers and some of the ex Facebook people who are leaving and are like, we have all this technology, but how do we still be human? And I
Mhm.
see bits and pieces of it or hints of it in some of the AI movement is like, yes, AI could be a useful and interesting tool, but how do we still be human beings?
Mhm.
How do we lead, the good life? How do we, and nobody's reading the great books anymore to figure out how do we find
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
it's really weird because, Kevin Kelly was very, very tightly associated with Wired, right? But and he goes back, his lineage goes back up to, Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth and, that those kind of weirdos, hippie
yeah.
cool, hippie tool users, right? The Whole Earth catalog was a catalog of tools, and there was this kind of counterculture thing happening at the same time that they were kind of replacing the main culture, especially in the Bay Area, right? And then, yeah, and the Well, right? And actually, the Well, it used to be, God, who was it? It was Bruce Sterling, and I don't think Corey was involved in it, but I think Bruce Sterling certainly every year they would do this thing that I would read from, this text stream from the Well on a bunch of these futurists would get together and talk about the future, talk about what they see in the year ahead, and then, what that implies for the years and years and years ahead. And it used to be really kind of interesting. It was entirely just it was just this big kind of massive tech discussion. And okay, and so Kevin leads to Tim Ferriss. That's interesting. Does he? Because have we lost a layer of a kind of a level of complexity, a layer of rigor when we've gone from,
Well,
Brandon Kevin Kennedy to Tim Ferriss? I mean, not to disparage Tim, but really?
well, I think there's a huge link there. I mean, Kevin probably been the person who's been on Tim Ferriss's podcast most often.
Hmm.
And even if he hasn't been present most often, he's probably the person that gets linked in by every other guest. Maybe not every guest, but
Mhm.
probably every other guest mentions Kevin.
Yeah.
So he's in there as like
So he's
Tim
he's an
mentioned.
intellectual godfather of sorts.
I, th- I no, he certainly gets mentioned in that sphere a lot.
Yeah.
And even with, you said about the music industry, the other person in that context that went from, bootleg bootleg cassettes to CDs to streaming is Derek Shivers. He ended up by selling off his internet version of Amazon for Music, as it were, making X whatever. And now he floats around the world based in New Zealand, having renounced his US citizenship because you tax everything.
Hmm. Yeah. It's
So,
weird because I mean because I mean there are a lot of these sort of points of sort of high intellectual kind of contribution an idea or a thought that kind of gets pinned to the board, right? And then little strings get drawn to it and stuff. But some of it is kind of deep and meaningful, like the lineage that Geron traces, back to oh God, what's his name? The guy who coined the term hypertext, Ted Nelson. And there's a lot around that. I mean, Ted Nelson had a lot of ideas. In other places, there are these weird little kind of one-off things, right? Like, Carrie Mullis, right? You know, while apparently tripping on acid, had the idea for the PCR chain reaction but then what else and I've actually started seeing documentaries that talk about okay, there's a whole lot of other people involved in actually kind of operationalizing this and turning it into a thing that actually worked after Mullis had his vision. And so maybe he doesn't deserve all the credit, but it's I mean there's almost this weird sort of cult of personality surrounding a lot of this stuff. And they did used to be these places where people would have conversations like this. Like the whole point of the Bill Joy article in the 2000 Hired magazine was he was responding to Ray Kurzweil, to a conversation that he had with Ray Kurzweil in a bar at a conference, kind of about futurism. And he wanted to sort of, kind of it was a long article. He wanted to respond and talk about some of the risks. I used to actually assign that when I used to teach kind of history of high tech. That was, one of those points on the way. But they're basically just like really kind of beads on a chain, really. And I think they connect. I think I can build a kind of a narrative structure that takes you from one to the next of them. But that just may be me thinking that.
Well, that it's some of that is, and we talked about it earlier, is in our reading over time, multiple books, we see and hear references of Hayek. But we've also seen and heard that there are ideas in his works that were taken and stripped out and used for whatever purpose,
Mhm.
but they didn't use all of his ideas. They used bits and pieces of the things that suited them at the time. So it's, yeah, you can draw that through line of, you take these, you cherry pick the pieces you want to live the life you want to live. And the
Mhm.
question is, which pieces are you going to specifically cherry pick?
Mhm.
And in the culture you're living, what are those other common pieces that everyone else around you has chosen to pick? Because that's going to influence what you also pick, but you don't get,
Yeah.
the pure,
Mhm.
we're not living Stuart Brand's specific brand of perfect life because everything else is influenced along the way. So we have little bits of this and little bits of that.
Yeah.
And
Well,
we're living in a Potemkin village of whatever was cherry picked for us to see.
mhm. And is it cherry picking or is it confirmation bias? Right.
Yeah.
So,
Or is it I'm drawing a boundary around this paragraph, and then I'm going to draw another boundary around 10 paragraphs later,
mhm.
and he skipped over something that's 2 paragraphs long in the middle. So how close how close do you read? How how are you actually making the cherry picking choice of the object,
And
not
that's a
necessarily the
thing.
decision, but the
Well, and
object?
to go back to the note making side of our explorations, right? That's been a thing that we have valorized. That's been a thing that we say, okay, that's a feature, not a bug, right? That you get to personalize, you get to go in and, I mean, all the way back to Sonke Ahrens, right? You get to go,
Like an
you
atomic
highlight,
note.
you make a personal set of notes from this original document. It's going to be different. Mine's going to be different from Mark's, going to be different from Chris's, going to be different from Pat's, right? And so Tim, so that is, I mean, that's been something that we've kind of assumed was positive. But yeah, what if people, because of their, at the very end of Plutocrats, Christopher Freeland's talking about, the power of cognitive capture is that it's fully internalized, she says. Most super elites genuinely are convinced that the policies that happen to serve their own interest or those of their firm or their industry are also right for everyone else. And how
Yeah.
do you avoid that? And how do you, I mean, and to go back to Chris, what you were saying about JD Vance, right? Does he, he leaves this, he runs away from his heritage, but does he bring anything with him? Does his
Yeah.
outlook, is his outlook informed by his heritage in a way that, had he grown up in Attleboro in the burbs where I did, he would have been a different guy.
I'm reminded of the example of A.N. Kolmogorov, who was a Soviet mathematician living in 1930s Russia.
Mhm.
And apparently, he didn't write a lot about it, although contemporaneous accounts were that he was not a big fan of the political regime in which he was living. But he, instead of worrying about the politics of where he lived and how, he spent all of his time and threw himself into the mathematics instead. And unbeknownst to most of the modern world, unless you're a mathematician or an information theorist, his name means nothing to anyone now. but he essentially tied analysis, pieces of number theory, and set and measure theory together and created the axioms of what we now call statistics.
Mhm.
And
Oh,
he
okay.
invented modern statistics
Oh, wow.
and laid the mathematical foundations for statistical theory in a way that heretofore was never seen or done. And in doing so, he helped make the modern world modern.
Mhm.
But because he was a Russian mathematician cut off from the West, it took a while for his stuff to exfiltrate and be translated. And then, he dramatically accelerated all of modernity because of the math work he did by ignoring the politics of his time. So at least once a month, I think, yes, I should be ignoring Donald Trump entirely and just focusing on doing the good work that I can as the means of maybe this is the thing that changes the world.
Mhm.
And I may never live to see it or derive any fame for it, but so I have a picture of A.N. Kolomarov off on the wall here that,
Uh,
I draw inspiration from because of that story.
Stick to your knitting. Yeah.
you know.
Cool. Cool. Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny because, also having said what I just said about, about all of our takes on these things being different and all the things that we highlighted and put into our notes being slightly different. I guess, you know, to be honest with myself, I don't think that there isn't a way of evaluating those notes. And I'm just finishing up a semester where I had my all in 3 classes, I had my students use hypothesis to annotate the ebook that I had made for them, and then ultimately the Obsidian thing that I made for them. And so certainly I am judging, I'm giving them credit for just participating, but I'm also judging the quality of the responses that they make, right? So certainly there are ways, objectively or subjectively, to evaluate these things and to say, well, my notes are better than yours, or the thing that I took out of this text was more meaningful, or was more to the point, or was closer to maybe the author's intent. So there is still, I guess there are still standards, right? And that's relevant. That I mean, there are still conversations that can be had. Yeah. The vampire squid theory of the super elite. I don't think she credited that. That's Matt Taibbi. Although the other guy, Hano, did quote Taibbi. So there you go. We haven't read a Taibbi book either.
No.
I've been wondering whether it makes sense to, go back and look at Hate Inc. I think is not going to age well because it was so focused on, on the problems of the media. But, maybe Griftopia might be something I might go back to. Because that fits in the whole democracy theme that I've been pursuing. Anyways, other last thoughts on. Oh,
I
I
mean,
highlighted. Go ahead.
one idea I mentioned Clayton Christensen. He has got a book about education, applying these principles of whatever he is to education. And I was influenced by it 10, 15 years ago. And it was referenced, one of these books talked about him. So oh yeah, I remember that guy. So I actually read the book again. And it was an interesting experience, partly because Christensen, talking about technology's role in education and some other things, made some specific predictions. And the passage of time has allowed now these predictions because they're going to happen by a certain
That's it.
date,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And I find that very interesting. Oh, this is going to happen. Okay, we're past that date. Did it happen?
Mhm.
That's kind of an interesting thing about even I found that very interesting about ideas now that rereading the thing you read before and were influenced by, and you think it's going to carry over in a certain way into whatever politics or education or whatever,
Mhm.
and then rereading the same book again and saying, well, that did or didn't happen,
Yeah.
and
What did happen?
why.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's interesting, and some of it ends up being just, blah 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 blah, right? I mean,
Right.
and what jumped out at me was that there's a paragraph at the end of Plutocrats as well where she's talking about academics in fields the plutocracy values can multiply their salaries by working as consultants and speakers to super elite audiences, often in the emerging markets, as Niall Ferguson told me, which is just a perfect example of this and of her name dropping, right? During a whirlwind weekend when he had given a speech to a private equity conference hosted by a Turkish plutocrat in Istanbul, followed by a speech in Yalta for Ukrainian plutocrat Viktor Pinchuk. The roads out of Cambridge, Massachusetts get jammed on Thursday evenings as Harvard Business School professors rush to the airport to get to their international speaking gigs. As a best-selling New York nonfiction writer who likes to tell his more literary and less well-off friends that his secret is to write books business people can read on a transatlantic flight. Uh, so that's the type of silliness that
Yeah.
I think doesn't stand the test of time,
Yeah.
right? But and is certainly not, Kolmogorov, who's ignoring what's happening in the moment and what people want to hear and what businessmen in business class want to read or listen to on their transatlantic flight and looking, and trying to engage with some type of real important
So the
truth.
real question is our book club on Saturday is distracting Dan from writing, some great historical book that's going to change the world because we distracted him every Saturday with the petty problems of day to day.
No, I think that I
Oh,
think
please, let's just have one simulation, not parallel one.
oh wow.
Or are we distracting Mark from writing the pedagogical treatise that's gonna
Not gonna happen.
blow
I'm
Paulo
tired.
Freire out of the water and dramatically change the future of education because
Yeah.
we distracted him from taking his, decades of experience and turning that into the new thing.
Well, I found that commenting about education now is a lot easier than when I had to gather data to make a point. Not having to gather data is a great advantage.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, excuse me. I think that I'm gonna jump out of this Plutocrats book and go back to Plutocracy in America and see if there's anything at the end of it.
I think the tough part for me in both of these is there's an interesting story to be drawn from what we can look back at the history and the pieces and say, this happened, and here's kind of philosophically where we're at.
Hmm.
But I find myself wanting them to take a position on how do we fix it? How do we change it? How do we shift away from, or historically, how have other places or times or things, what have they done in the research they did on oligarchies and plutocracies? How did historically those other examples shift away from those things? Or were they, did the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire shift away because dramatic things happened or massive collapse? Were they fell in on themselves? And if that's the case, how do we avoid that dramatic collapse and
Hmm.
have a soft landing?
Right.
You
Right.
know, or what's the prescriptive, where do we go from here piece, or at
Right.
least hints of where do we go,
Right.
how do we shift that? And
Right.
it's a harder question, but given the research they've done and the stories that they're telling, they should be able to at least hint at, what do they think we should do as a
Yeah.
result of.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, and to compare that with what, with Pat in the chat when it gets intolerable revolution. What I wonder about is, is that shift from, for example, sort of the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era, right? And then the market crash and the recovery during the Great Depression with the New Deal. Would that have happened without the market crash? Was the shift from the Gilded Age to progressivism, was that even real? Was it, is that something that can be measured? Is there a world in which elites don't disappear, but they become less sort of extractive? And maybe the issue is that there are times historically, there are times when we're in a more zero sum kind of a circumstance, and then there are times when we're in a kind of a more open-ended sort of positive sum circumstance. Certainly, the tech, I mean, we were talking earlier about these elites from the tech revolution who, because they came of age in this positive sum world where all of this new value was being added, whether or not it turned out to be ultimately socially positive or negative, it was economically valuable, that they believed in, that in a more open-ended kind of an outcome. And maybe that correlates with at least how the culture perceives itself, which I'm not sure 100% correlates with whether or not things are really better or worse for the people who are not in the spotlight. I think that's that's an unresolved question. But it does seem to me that we've heard, in a couple of the things we've heard people refer to the idea that it only takes 5% to kind of shift the direction. Right. And 5% certainly is a whole lot easier to achieve than 50% or 50% plus one in a straight democracy. So there have been we have along the way kind of had a couple of those hopeful moments. I don't think either of these, yeah, I agree, Chris. I don't think either of these things that we read the last few weeks pointed to a way out of the maze. But ultimately, that's what we're looking for. Maybe Hayek will have some things to say about that from 100 years ago. You're muted, Tim.
So what's the minimum retarget for Hayek?
I think the intros are optional. I'm gonna listen to them because I'll have the Audible as well. But I was thinking the first 5 sections.
First 5 sections.
They're short.
Okay.
It's less than 100 pages. I mean, it's probably more like 50 or so pages.
If it's 100 pages of A3 at 10.3. Right?
Yeah, maybe. It's I think that, like I said, I think when I was looking at it on and the brief view that it gave me on Amazon, looked like the actual text began around 65, and the end of the fifth chapter was like 111. So it should be, and I think that would be enough. I mean, it seemed like thematically that would be enough to give us, some things to talk about.
Well, hopefully it should be relatively heavy enough weight to occupy us.
Yeah, I think it did help get us into the present situation. Yes, but then we're again bypassing Keynes. So maybe he'll have some things to say that will point us to to some. Yeah, I think that moment. I think the moment at the Bretton Woods Hotel is probably fairly relevant and interesting, and I should dig more into that history.
Yeah.
And you're away for 1 week, not 2.
I will be back. Let me be specific.
Oh yeah, what's our schedule?
Yeah, our schedule is I will be away next week on the 24th. I will be back on the 31st. Yeah, so we'll resume on the 31st. Yeah, I'll be in Austria for 10 days, but I'll be back by Wednesday, the 28th.
Have a good trip.
Okay.
Thank you.
Have fun.
Yeah. Yeah, it should be fun. We're dropping into Vienna on the 19th and then driving westward along the Danube to see all the places that I've seen photographs of myself at as a 5-year-old.
Well,
Try not to buy too many copies of Mozart.
Yeah, so we'll see if or ceramics at Gmunden. My mom's got a bunch of ceramics from Gmunden, but apparently they're working on a different style now. So maybe I'll have to get something.
enjoy the Viennoiserie.
Thank you. And the Linzer Tort. And
Oh yeah,
yep. Yep.
all the crescent-shaped pastries you can manage to stuff in.
Right. All right. Cool. Well, have a good week.
Take
And
care.
see you in a couple. Ciao.